Good morning, everybody. This is Jane here at the Stitch and Post, and this is going to be the first of our little video series of tutorials that we're doing to help you with the Cozy Christmas block of the week that we're doing. This one is going to be the basics of wool applique. The wool applique in this project is really simple and beginner friendly, and I think you will really enjoy it. So this is the first block number 1 in the quilt. So this is the first one that you will be making. As I demo today, I'm actually going to be using one of the subsequent blocks in my example, simply because I already have this one done. So I'm going to be working with the wools from a different block, but the principles are definitely the same. So I'd like to start off by just describing the materials that you need to gather together so that you can do your wool applique. The first one will be the number 1 kit, the block 1 kit for the Cozy Christmas. This has a lot of stuff in here because we've packaged our block of the week so that you'll be able to complete an entire block every week. So there's a lot of cotton fabrics in here, but what I want you to focus on for this purpose is the background fabric for your applique block and the wool pieces. So if you would just leave everything else in the kit, take out that background piece and the 2 wools, so you can pull those out and lay them aside. I'm going to be, you will also want the pattern, which is on the back side of your kit here, the pattern for block number 1. You see that I have the pattern out for block number 4, which is the one that I'm going to be using as we go through this today, but you'll be using the pattern for block number 1. You want to use a double-sided fusible web product. Some wool designers recommend the use of a double-sided fusible web and some don't, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both, but because our designer from Calico Patch Designs does recommend using a double-sided fusible, we're doing that in our quilt. And the one that we really prefer is the Shades Soft Fuse. It's a very lightweight, fusible product that does not make your project stiff. It does not gum up your needle when you sew through it, and it just gives a very nice finished result. So you see that I've just cut myself a little shape here from the soft fuse because you're not going to need very much for each block. So you want to have that ready. To trace your pieces, you just want a pencil. It can be a mechanical pencil or a regular number 2 lead pencil, sharp enough to draw a nice line, but not so sharp that it's going to be breaking on you when you try to trace with it. So you need a pencil. You need a pressing station. I have set up my little mini iron and my little steam-fast mini iron and my wool pressing mat. If you have a wool pressing mat, it's a very helpful thing to use throughout this project. If you don't, you might want to put that on your wish list for down the line. You need a square ruler. It needs to be larger than 8 inches. So this one happens to be 9.5 inches square, the 9.5 inch square Creative Grids ruler, which happened to be a size I had readily available, and so I picked that one up. But as long as it's bigger than 8 inches, you'll be fine. You need some nice sharp scissors for cutting out your wool pieces. Our favorite scissors for this is the Karen K. Buckley Perfect Scissors. They come in a variety of sizes. This is one of the kind of the middle-sized option. The purple handled ones, which I also have, are a little bit larger. Those would be fine as well. They are micro-serrated, so they grip that textured wool and help you to cut your pieces exactly on your lines that you've traced. If you have an applique pressing sheet, Teflon pressing sheet, you will want to get that out. That will help you as you're arranging your applique pieces and getting them positioned prior to putting them on your background fabric. When we get ready to stitch, You will be using a fiber of your choice. The simplest to find and least expensive is just DMC embroidery floss. If you are using floss, we will separate it so that you will use 2 of the 6 strands, and you just want to find some colors that match the wools that you're using for your applique. And you may have a needle that you prefer for wool applique, but I have found these number 24, size 24 chenille needles by Primitive Gatherings to be a very nice needle. They're short when you first look at them. They almost make you think they might be too short at first, but they stitch beautifully through the wool and help you to make very nice stitches. So that is all of the supplies that you need to have gathered, and you may want to pause the video at this point and restart after you have gathered all of your supplies. Welcome back, everybody. We are ready for the next step in our wool applique tutorial, and that will be to trace and prepare our wool pieces. So if you take a look at the pattern, you're going to be using the pattern for block 1, but the principles are the same here with this pattern for block 4. If you open this pattern and look at the diagrams down here, you will see that on the right hand side there are separate or separated pieces of the applique project, and then on the right is what the applique looks like when it's put together to be fused to the background fabric. You notice that these are reversed, and the reason for that is you're going to be using the fusible web, so you need to trace the reversed version of the pattern onto your paper of your fusible web. So if you lay your pattern down, take your piece of soft fuse, lay it over the pattern. You see that it's very easy to see the lines looking through the soft fuse, and take your pencil and simply trace around the black lines as you move from one piece to the next. You want to leave, I'm going to scoot my pattern just a little bit so that I'm going to leave about 1/4 of an inch between my pieces as I'm tracing them. I don't need to leave a lot of room, but I do need to leave a little bit of room between those pieces. So I'm going to move the pattern just a bit. So when I finish my tracing, this is what I'm going to have. So I've got my mitten, a little bit of space, and then my cuff portion. So when you trace your block number 1, you're going to be tracing the 2 holly leaves, again leaving a little bit of space between those on the green wool, and then the 3 little circles for the holly berries. When you get these pieces traced, you want to take something I forgot to put in the supply list. If you have some paper scissors handy, grab those paper scissors and cut out sort of a rough cut around these pieces with about 1/8 of an inch margin. This does not need to be exact at all, so don't spend a lot of time doing this. I'm going to lay it on the black background here so that you can see that I've left a little bit of a margin all the way around my piece. And I will do that for both of my, or however many applique pieces I have. Once I have traced my pieces, I will then find my corresponding wool piece, lay the traced applique piece design on the wool, and press. You really want to use a dry iron at this stage. And you can press for 8 or 10 seconds. Soft fuse is very resistant. You can't really overheat it. And that will fuse your traced piece to your wool. Once you've got all of your pieces fused onto the wool, then you're going to take your micro serrated scissors and cut the pieces out, and try to be, as exact as you can here to cut these out on the line that you've traced. These are pretty simple wool applique designs, so the cutting is not difficult, and the micro serrated scissors definitely reduce the hand fatigue and help to make the cutting more accurate. So once you have all of your pieces cut out on the traced line, then we will be ready to move on to the next step. So you may want to pause the video at this point and prepare all of your pieces. All right, everybody, we're ready for the next portion of our wool applique tutorial. You should now have your wool applique pieces cut out. The paper backing will still be on the fusible web, but the pieces are ready. They're set aside here. What we will do next is we'll take our background square. Now this background square is cut larger than what the finished size is going to be. You always want to do that when you are doing applique, because as you stitch your applique on here, it's going to draw that square up a little bit, and you want to make sure that it's not too small when you're finished. So we will do our applique, and then later on in the process, we'll come back and trim this block down to the final finished size. But to start out with, we want to find the center of this square so that we know where to place our applique pieces. If you just take the square and fold it in half, let me get it right side up here, fold it in half and finger press a crease, do horizontally, and then fold it the other way, so that you have the center marked with a crease, both horizontally and vertically. You don't really want to press that crease with the iron because it's just going to make it harder to get rid of later. But I can see I have a crease here and I have a crease here. The center is going to be right here. So I'm going to set that aside now. And I'm going to take my pattern. Now again, I'm using block number 4. You're going to be doing block number 1. But if I use my square ruler here, which is not so big that it's difficult and awkward to handle, I'm going to lay it on this design and get an idea of what the dimensions of my applique design are. So in this particular case, the widest part of the design is about 4.5. I'm sorry, the widest part of the design is about 3.5. The longest part of the design is about 4.5. So the center point of that is going to be right about over here on the snowflake in the middle of the mitten. And in fact, it's going to be right about here, right about there. So when I center my applique on my block, I'm going to use that as my center point on my design to line up with the center point on my background fabric. On your design, you're going to be measuring the holly leaves, so you're just going to find the dimensions of those, and it looks like it's about 4.5 by about 4. So figure out your center point, and you'll know where you want to line your design up with your background fabric. You're going to do that with each block that you make. So once you've kind of gotten an idea of where your center is, and again, this is not critical because you're going to be trimming that block down, but you do want to have it approximately centered as you're making it. At this point, you can take your applique pressing sheet and position it over the diagram for your applique layout. And again, you can see through the applique pressing sheet the lines of where the applique pieces need to go. At this point, I'm actually going to scoot this onto my pressing station so that I can press directly on here without having to move this. I'm going to take the paper backing off. This is really important. Take the paper backing off, and as I peel the paper off, you can see the web is on the back of the wool, and it's staying on as I peel the paper away. I take that piece and I place it, and when you do this, you want to be working from the bottom up. So you put down first the pieces that are going to be covered by other pieces. Get that positioned. There's just a slight bit of tackiness to the fusible web, which makes it easy to get that in position. Now I'm going to take my next piece. I'm going to peel the paper off, and I'm going to put it in position. And on this block, there are actually only these two pieces. If I had other pieces, I would continue to add them as they're going from bottom to top. Once I get them in position, I can take my iron and press. What this is doing is fusing the applique pieces to each other so that it will be easier for me to transfer them to my background fabric. I'm going to set this aside and let it cool a moment. I'm going to take my background fabric, and this snowflake fabric, make sure that you know which is the right side and which is the wrong side. These snowflakes are a little more prominent on the right side. Here is my center point, and if you like, you can use a friction pen and actually mark that point on there, but I can see the creases well enough. And my center point that I marked on the pattern is right here. So I'm going to line those two center points up. There's my creases. My snowflake underneath with my center point is right there. So my mitten is now positioned approximately in the middle of my block. If I take my applique sheet and carefully peel away the applique pieces and try not to let them become separated from each other after you've done such a nice job of getting them fused together. Lay them on the background. You can double check your lines to make sure you've got them where they need to go. And once you're satisfied that everything is correctly positioned, you can now fuse this into place. I'm going to move my pattern out of the way and press. And I like to press about 10 seconds when I'm doing this step in the process. Keep moving your iron if you can't cover the whole area. All right, I now have my applique pieces securely fused to my background fabric, and I'm ready to begin stitching. So I'm going to let you all pause the video at this point, and when you have your pieces fused in place, we will continue and do the stitching. All right, everybody, we're ready to continue now. We've got our applique pieces fused onto our background fabric, and we are going to stitch these down with a blanket stitch. You can use a whip stitch also when you're doing wool applique, but our designer suggests a blanket stitch, and so that's what we're going to be doing. You could, if you wanted to, do this part of the process on your sewing machine. Most of us have a blanket stitch of some sort on our sewing machine, so you could thread up your machine and stitch these down on the sewing machine if you were so inclined. But what we're going to show you today is how to do it by hand. Again, you can use embroidery floss, or you can use size 12 pearl cotton. Baldani size 12 pearl cotton is an absolutely wonderful fiber. It's available in a wide assortment of colors. We decided for our shop sample of this quilt, we were gonna do the DMC floss simply because we wanted to give you the option of keeping the cost down on this project. But if you happen to be a wool applique person who has a nice selection of Baldani 12 weight, you certainly may want to use that. If you're using DMC floss, you want to cut a length. This is about probably a 24-inch length of floss. It does go pretty quickly when you're doing the blanket stitch, so you can use a reasonably long segment of floss. I like to separate my floss one strand at a time. There are 6 strands in the floss as it comes. If you hold the floss about half an inch or so from the end, get a hold of one strand, pull it out, then get a hold of another strand, pull it out. Now I've got 2 strands separated, and that's what I want to use for my stitching. I'm going to set the other 4 aside. They can be used when this one is all gone. And I'm going to then put these 2 strands back together. That will help to keep them nice and flat. Here is my size 24 chenille needle. So I'm going to thread my needle, and I'm going to tie a knot in one end. So you see my ends are not even. I don't want to tie a knot in both ends. I only want to tie a knot in one end. So I'm going to just do the little technique of wrapping the thread around the needle and pulling it through to make my knot. I've got a good secure knot now. Now I'm going to show you how to make this stitch, and usually in these designs you're going to be using a thread that's going to match the wool that you're using. On block 4 here, she has actually used red to stitch around the cuff of the mitten, around the green, as well as around the mitten itself. So I'm going to be using red. I'm going to be stitching on the cuff so that there will be a contrast and you'll be able to see the stitches better. You want to start your stitching on a straight area of the applique. So I'm going to bring my needle up along the top of the cuff, and I'm bringing it up adjacent to the edge of the applique piece. I'm coming up through the background fabric adjacent to the applique piece. I'm going to pull it through until my knot reaches the back of my fabric, and I can feel that underneath with my finger. Now, the stitch size is not as important as the uniformity of your stitches. So I was kind of shooting for a stitch size of a little less than 1/4 of an inch, somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. You don't want your stitches to be too big. On some of these pieces, on some of the blocks are kind of small, so don't let your stitches get too big. But your blanket stitch has a segment that goes lengthwise and then a leg that goes out onto the applique fabric. And you want each of those legs to be approximately the same size. So here's the point where I came out. I'm going to come over a little less than 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to come in a little less than 1/4 of an inch and go down through both layers, the wool and the background fabric. I'm going to bring my needle out again through the background fabric adjacent to the edge of the applique piece. Now you notice there that my needle is sitting over my thread, and that's how I want it to be, so that when I pull it through, my thread forms my L of my blanket stitch. So I've come this way and I've caught both layers of fabric here in this leg. I'm going to do the same thing again. Come over about a little less than 1/4 of an inch, come in a little less than 1/4 of an inch, and take another stitch. And it's very important to make sure when your needle comes out that your thread is underneath it. Otherwise, it's not going to form that stitch correctly. So you just kind of keep going here, going around the curved portion of the top of the cuff. And I chose that particular spot as my starting point because I wanted to come around here to this sharper corner and show you how I like to deal with a corner. So corners can be a little tricky. You want to make sure that that sharp corner of the wool is held down securely. So when I do that, I'm not going my full 1/4 inch over here. I'm going to make an angled, sort of a mitered, if you will, stitch at the corner. So I'm actually going back in pretty close to where my previous stitch was, and I'm coming out through the base fabric at the corner, right at the corner. So this stitch is angled toward the corner. When I pull this one through, you see that this leg of the stitch is sitting right over that corner fabric. I like to actually anchor that stitch by taking my thread to the back and pulling that down firmly. So I've really got that corner anchored now. Then when I start again, I will bring my thread up at the corner. Try to get it where you can see here that I'm bringing it up just inside the loop of that previous stitch. So I've anchored my corner. Now I'm bringing my thread back up to start again, and I'll turn my work and proceed again, making a stitch to complete my mitered corner, go back in pretty close to where the previous stitch was, come out, and I'm ready now to keep going right on along the bottom edge of my cuff. And again, the size of the stitches is not as important as the uniformity of the stitches, and they don't have to be perfect. Handwork is not perfect. That's why it's so wonderful, and that's why we love it so much. So you'll just do the blanket stitch around each of your applique pieces, which won't take long, and typically you will be using a matching color, which will help to camouflage any little irregularities that you might have in your stitching. Once you complete the blanket stitching, then often the blocks will have some little additional surface embroidery that will be done, and on block 1 you can see that the leaf veins are stitched here after the blanket stitching is completed. You can choose whatever color floss you want to use here. I chose a color a little bit darker than what I used for my applique stitching, and I believe in the instructions she actually says this is done with a running stitch. A running stitch is, you could do that if you wish to, but it's not going to give you a solid line here. It's going to give you more like a dotted line, because you go up through the fabric down, and part of your stitch is going to lie on the back of your fabric. I decided to use a back stitch to do my leaf veins because I just thought it gave it a little bit more of a prominent look. When I do the stitching on the mitten, there is some surface embroidery to make this snowflake, and I believe I will use a back stitch again as I do the snowflake. There are some beads, and on some of the blocks, some little buttons that are added. You will probably want to wait until your quilt is finished and quilted before you add those little embellishments, depending on how your quilt is going to be quilted. Those potentially could be in the way for the long arm quilter, whether that be you or someone else who's quilting your quilt. So you may want to hold off. We will give you those little embellishments, so you will have them along the way, but you may want to wait until your quilt is completed before you add those. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful. We will be adding a video tutorial for doing the snowball corners on your applique block, and a video tutorial for the half square triangle technique that we have used. So you can look for the links to those to be forthcoming very shortly. Thank you so much.